It was the slaves of the Habsburgs that Baroque, and I'm spelling that like the Baroque architecture and paintings. It was the slaves of the royal Habsburgs that Baroque the minds and bodies of those deceived after Armageddon with Mudflood was Armageddon theology. Millions now know the truth of the so called 1,000 year dark age. It was fake. The world, under the guise tricked by a fake church with a Trinitarian God that saved her people by having a son and proving how much she loved the father. It's that ISIS thing. It is that ISIS thing. Yesterday was hard for me when I was reading about Mexico and I saw an autobiography of the first archbishop that was sent there. And after 40 years, he said, look, we cannot keep giving you gold at the same quantities. All of the slaves have been worked to death. And the masons that we bring down from the mountains to build all the stone cities and all the stone buildings in and around Mexico City and everywhere else, where they replaced that city that was built on a lake. It was Spain and France and England all along after the 1,000 years when Satan was loosed. You must focus on the fact that, yes, Mudflood was Armageddon, but after the 1,000 years, there was that put in your sickle and reap. The wheats and the tares that had grown together were judged. And here we are, somehow as recently as our grandparents were oblivious to it, working as slaves, but I don't think too many of them were the ruling elite. Let's see what we have and go from there. I want to say Allah. I know I've been missing a lot of things in the chat of people I should recognize. Limited as our scope of influence is, the idea of it being about you is we are responsible for every word, thought, and deed. There's the disclaimerage. Few pictures of today, some captions maybe. Law number one, things that are at rest, stay at rest. That's Newton. He was fake, going the wrong way. I thought we had more here. Okay, we're going to be looking at isolated incidents where Satai in the 1900s, in 1987, they had to criminalize the aiding or glorifying of Satai. That's bride burning, where the women of India until the 1980s were setting themselves on fire because that's what Hindus did then. This is a picture from it, etching from the 1800s purporting to show a Hindu widow being led past the body of her dead husband to the funeral fire. Sad days, sad times. For every action, 3 equal opposite. Force equals mass times acceleration. Things at rest stay at rest. This was the very first transistor in the 1960s. Somebody just clamped a piece of crystal and everything changed in this right after World War II. You know, the United Nations in 1934, until the Zionists in Jerusalem, what they call fake Jerusalem today, said, no, this way with the 13th month calendar that the United Nations, the League of Nations, is proposing in 1934, it would make the Sabbath be on a Thursday, and that won't work for us. So they said, okay, we'll go with something else. There's a poem from one of the students. Lies, lies. These students, they're all hurt. They're all being lied to. So you got that figured out now. Hopefully that was sharing, I do believe. Let's pick it up and let's keep rolling. So we got this was where I was picking up on that deal.
Younger Dryas. But why did we get rid of it? Well, actually, a lot of places still use versions of these ancient calendars. The Chinese and the Jews, for example, have a type of lunar calendar that add this extra month period occasionally. It is only our modern civilization that has abandoned this way of timekeeping for a standardized and flawed system. A lot can be hidden when the way time is tracked is corrupt.
You know what could be hidden? That it's flat earth nation with the golden age past. That's what's being hidden. Give us the breakdown.
The Igbo calendar from Nigeria uses this 28-day month system, resulting in 13 months. The Berber calendar of North Africa. The Maori
different skin tone
calendar in New Zealand, and several ancient Hindu calendars use this 13th month as a leap month as well. Also the Hebrew calendar, the Babylonian calendar, the ancient Chinese calendar, and the Thai lunar calendar. And many other various indigenous groups had a 13th month in their tracking of time as well.
But this is about you, not that.
Called real wealth of nations actually was. Money and power were now unshackled from metal and driven by printing presses, credit, and persuasion. And once governments tasted that freedom, they never went back. The financial war now began in earnest. For Germany, isolated from global capital markets and blockaded by the Royal Navy, the only option was domestic borrowing. Berlin launched massive bond drives, appealing to patriotism, urging ordinary citizens to pour their savings into war loans. The propaganda was relentless. Posters of heroic soldiers, families urged to sacrifice luxuries for the fatherland, and constant promises that investors would be repaid after victory. In total, Germany raised over 100 billion marks this way, but it was a pyramid built on hope. When defeat came, those bonds were worthless. Millions of Germans saw their life savings wiped out, and that bitterness became fertile ground for extremism in the decades ahead.
Now, what caused this? What kind of burden were they under?
Yet at the start of this war, most governments believed it would be quick, maybe over by Christmas. They thought they could pay for it the old-fashioned weapon, and one of the deadliest ever invented. In 1914, Europe was already a powder keg. National rivalries, colonial ambitions, and military alliances had turned the continent into a chessboard of paranoia. But beneath all the speeches about honor and empire, there was...
They had convinced the world, deism, if there was a God, you're on your own. Colonization. Was this Armageddon? Worshipping the fiat dollar, the no king but Caesar? Or was this the end of the golden age? And they those pictures from the Civil War are not very convincing, whatever Civil War you're talking about.
Financial reality. War on this scale was impossible to fight without unimaginable sums of money. And here's the brutal truth. When leaders chose war, they were also choosing debt. Every empire marching its troops to the front line was also marching its people into a future of economic burden. Yet at the start of this war, most governments believed it would be quick, maybe over by Christmas. They thought they could pay for it the old-fashioned way, with gold, with limited borrowing, with patriotic donations. Within weeks, that illusion collapsed. The war was burning money faster than anyone could imagine. Let's be precise. In the summer of 1914, the financial...
After the creature from Jekyll Island in 1913, RJ wanted me to remind you of that.
The system of Europe still revolved around the gold standard. Nations promised that their paper money could be exchanged for actual gold, a system that gave currencies credibility but also tied the hands of governments. Gold reserves were finite. You could not just print endlessly without losing the trust of your people and your creditors. Britain, France, and Germany all had respectable reserves, but once millions of men were mobilized and industry was redirected to weapons, the costs skyrocketed. Germany alone was spending over 10 million marks per day by late 1914, and Britain's war costs would soon reach £2.5 million every
Where was the
single day.
gold going?
The math was merciless. The gold would not last. So the governments suspended the rules. One by one, the major powers abandoned the gold standard, quietly admitting to their citizens that money was now essentially a promise, backed by nothing more than faith in the state. In that moment, the breaking of the gold anchor was one of the most important financial shifts in modern history. It showed how fragile the so-called real wealth of nations actually was. Money and power were now unshackled from metal.
Well, that happened. And, World War I ended in an armistice. That means the war is still going. Here is what secret societies, early Christians, he thinks they are pretty good. But then again, China is trying to set us up because we addicted them to heroin and took over their country with the help of the British. Well, they made us do it.
Believe Christianity. Right? The first 5 commandments are what Jews believe to be true. But they do believe that eventually someone will return to restore the kingdom of David. Okay? But not Jesus. Not Jesus. The Christians believe that Jesus is the final prophet. Okay? In fact, Jesus is God himself. That's why it's called Christianity. Because they believe in Jesus Christ. So this is the entire history of Judaism and Christianity. What they believe, officially. Any questions before I move on? Okay, so now as you can understand, if you are a true Christian or you're a true Jew, there are actually lots of issues with this understanding. Okay? The first issue is, why did God have to kick us out of the Garden of Eden? I mean, was eating of fruit so bad as to banish us from paradise?
Obviously, if you doubt that, then you've left orthodoxy. And these people were forcing a Trinitarian belief where they would fillet you, skin you alive, burn you, because they were the bad guys. They were not really Christians either.
What was wrong with eating that fruit? Okay, that's a great mystery in the religion. Why did the original sin happen? And why was God so angry?
That is called the infralapsarian and infralapsarianism argument.
Problem is Noah. I mean, God destroyed the world because we were wicked. But after he destroyed the world, we were still wicked. So why did God have to destroy the world in the first place? If he's God, then
He is God, and it's an object lesson for the angels. Let's see so the United Nations did have something they called the International Calendar, also Calendar Reform and ISO Week. They were going to do it. Some places it was used until 1989. Because the Kodak people liked it. It was a perennial calendar, first presented in 1902. But it didn't fit in with the Zionistic plan, so I'm told. So I believe. What's this other calendar we got here? Calendar Reform. Because they had to unite the nations into the United Nations, and then you're going to have another pandemic, and then you're going to see people eating their own children, and nobody's going to like that. We want to keep the young people and the old people from seeing that kind of stuff. The Gregorian, Julian, do they give us the right year, or I'm just basing it on their Gregorian calendar because years are pretty close to years. So we do have world calendars, perennial calendars. You can divide it up any way. Why they chose what they chose was to cover up not reveal, that is what they do. The mortgage industry has weathered many changes over the past several years. And now BlackRock and those people own all the money. When my father and my wife's father were buying houses, you could buy a house for $27,000, make $90 payments for 30 years, and you'd own it. That house today is worth about $400,000, and you can't afford it. You can't rent it. It's owned by people that are just going to try to, make you spend way too much. And we're living in that time where if you look up liquidity, they go, what do you mean? Market liquidity, accounting liquidity, funding liquidity, liquid capital. They're talking about how much fiat money do you have at risk? It's so recent. And it all comes back to
So even though
John Maynard Keyes, a time when sexuality was outlawed in the United States, they made exceptions for him for a while because he was so smart, he could figure out the economic things. He bought Newton's role and exposed him as a Trinitarian loving alchemist who practiced the occult as a Jesuit or something like that.
Daniel and John were different people, they both, as prophets, spoke the mind of God. They were divinely inspired, and so whatever they wrote came from God himself. So by examining their prophecies, you are deciphering God's purpose for humanity. Okay, and this is the foundation for Christian Zionism. Okay, so that's the first thing you need to understand about Newton, that he was first and foremost a theologian and not a scientist. Okay. Second thing that you must understand about Newton is that he was a member of secret societies in England at that time. Now, today, when we think of secret societies, we think of nefarious,
bad people that take death vows and have to, they're the bad guys.
underground conspiracies. But at that time, secret societies were actually very common and very well accepted.
Right, because the wolves in sheep clothing thing, we got that. I want to jump ahead.
Outlaw them eventually, but their teachings went underground and they became embedded in these secret societies. Okay, so when Newton joined these secret societies, and when he was able to discover the laws of the universe, well, I imagine that these men celebrate Newton as a prophet, as a messiah, as a chosen one, as someone who would reveal the secret teachings of God to the world. And because the world was not ready for these teachings, then they would make it their mission to keep it secret and wait for the day when they could reveal these teachings to the world. So
now, my contention is that Isaac Newton is like their Messiah. England, different, Anglican, they broke off, they became their own popish type thing. The whole British Israelism, the gospel of Mary, she brought what was it? What were they looking for? The Holy Grail? It was her baby. They brought it to England, and now England's swinging like a pendulum do.
the value and the credibility of royal coinage against counterfeiters. And so to deal with counterfeiters, he set up a network of spies to identify these counterfeiters, sometimes to torture them for information, and for the most egregious offenders, they will be executed. Okay, so in other words, Newton established England's very first intelligence agency,
Because Newton was the head of the mint.
intelligence apparatus. In 1865, the United States Treasury Department established the Secret Service. What's their job? The job was to identify counterfeiters. Why were they called the Secret Service? Because the Treasury Department didn't want people to know.
Huh. Let's keep going. I looked up something else. Who was the good kid in baseball? Lou Boudreau. I remember reading a baseball book about him, and it seemed like they, you know, when I was reading about him in the 60s, it made it seem like it was so long ago. 21-year-old, broke into baseball, born a Jew, raised a Catholic, played 10 seasons as a player and a manager. Harvey, Illinois, Orthodox Jew, raised Roman Catholic in Illinois. And baseball was the Pied Piper. I got to keep going because I got class, and was Sally Heming white looking? Turns out she was, because they had a practice in Mexico where, you know, once they got children of mixed race, they wanted them treated special after the millions were dead, and after they had built this lake to build a model of an eyeball that we live on. I've gone into that before, and time does not allow it now. They tricked them into surrendering, basically working as slaves to death for gold and to build stone buildings in Mexico to cover up the past. And they admit it. And if they're doing it in Mexico and in Europe, we know now they did it everywhere. And they used the slaves who had been deceived by secret societies who could have planted rumors that someday in the future, blue-eyed prophets will come and it will be our doom. And they made it happen. We still have to deal with the fact that there was this. When the Spanish Roman Catholics started breeding, they didn't want to punish their children. Whereas in the United States, with the whole, you know, Sally Heming thing, she was 14-year-old white girl when she started getting raped by the president of the United States. It probably before that, because of all of his, you know, half children, half slaves, half whatever. By the time she was 14, he said, no, that's the one I'm taking to Paris to show off to my other Freemason friends. And their descendants live as white people. We had laws where the one drop rule was in effect. One drop, and you have to play in a different baseball league, you know? Because you weren't allowed to play with white people. You had to have black movies. Because in the early 1900s, it never tells us the exact date, the United States passed the one drop law. And they were doing that. At the same time, things were worse. Supposedly, the smartest people in the world are the Indians the Hindus from India. And until the 1980s, they're still burning their women alive in the sati practice, where the Hindu princesses and lords burnt themselves alive. And they'll beat you in chess every time. Take my word for it. If you get the hold of the right one. Oh, they're not all as good as they think, but they're pretty, I guess, you know, hey, they're number one in those IQ tests for a reason, I guess. Only a few of a Chinese are as smart as them and some Japanese, but it's not us. Goes back thousands of years because, well, that's what the other gods wanted, is human sacrifice. Here on this object lesson for the angels, the physical reality, remember, there was a beginning where in the beginning, everything was spirit. And now it's not. So we have that. We have the Negro Leagues. I've shown you that it was different in Mexico, but they worked them to death building, the Baroque buildings for the Baroque architecture that was going on around the world because they had to cover up what? I know, and the American people know they had to cover up that the mud flood was Armageddon. The Bible is true. Everything Jesus said was true. We live in that time. The wheats and the tares grew together. Now we have our orphan trained brains, and until God opens our eyes, permanent cognitive dissonance. We're programmed with the globe, programmed with the Trinity from the moment of our birth. But it doesn't have to be that way. There's always that chance that you hear his voice because your ears are open, your eyes see the truth, and at some point in real-time history, you've been predestined, called, and elected, chosen from before the foundation of the earth to find yourself on your knees, knowing you can be forgiven, being forgiven, believing in your heart, and then confessing with your mouth that Jesus Christ is Lord, the Creator. The governments will be on his shoulders. He'll be called Wonderful, the Everlasting Counselor, Almighty God, Everlasting Father, and he is. Me and my friends will never tell you anything else. Amen. Hallelujah. Aho. Aloha. Arrivederci. Ciao. Sayonara. Auf Wiedersehen. Nachgemet. Adios, amigos.